questions?
No, it's good. You ask the questions and we go to the
Okay. We can take questions from the audience if we have a question
We
back
have a
here.
mic runner. We do rules of thumb. Please identify yourself, who you're affiliated with, and please ask your question in the form of a question.
While we're waiting on that question, Rob, one thing that I noticed, you mentioned the confluence of events with expensing going away. Also what's occurring in the R&E amortization, also what's occurring at the same time is a tightening of the interest expense deductibility. Does that exacerbate your concerns about growth potential in the out years, or is that not relevant?
No, I think it is relevant. I think it is relevant. It's frankly, it's an incredibly complex issue economically because it's affected by interest rates, which are affecting the financing, and it itself will have a feedback effect. My inclination is to say yes, it makes it worse, but frankly, I haven't modeled it, so I'm not sure. What I can say is that what this, and Dan alluded to this, and so did Gail, this bill is really in the same bucket as the impulses towards protectionism that we see throughout this administration. That is, we think of the tax changes in three buckets. There's changes to the personal code, and that's where most of the benefits for high-income people come from. There are changes to the corporate code which affect the domestic activities of U.S. corporations, and only the domestic activities. And then there's the international aspects, which affect the international aspects of U.S. corporations. Well, the fact is, all of the provisions on the personal side sunset December 31st, 2025, with a few minor exceptions, including, for some reason, the deductibility of alimony, which is permanent. I don't know why. Virtually none of the corporate changes sunset except the expensing, which is the single most powerful change with respect to U.S. investment. None of the international provisions expire either. However, the corporate provisions which stay reduce taxes on the domestic activities of U.S. corporations by about $650 billion over 10 years. The international aspects increase the tax burden on the international aspects of U.S. corporations by $325 billion over 10 years. So we are clearly and unequivocally penalizing the international activities of U.S. corporations as against the domestic activities. And that's what I call tax protectionism.
Thank you, Rob. Sir, you have a question?
Absolutely. This may be a question for you, Ed. Sean Mulvaney with Procter & Gamble. My question really relates to maybe the foreign-derived intangible income provision or the BEAT income provision. And it relates to the WTO. And how would you benchmark these with the concept of national treatment? Because I think that's going to be a critical issue as our trading partners review these provisions. So I'm interested in any insights that the panel could offer. Thank you.
Okay, Sean, I was afraid that question would come up at some point. I was actually working for the committee when the FISC WTO action ripened, and look at my former colleague Tim down here, and then the ETI, and eventually the 199 that you mentioned is where it led. I certainly am not a trade specialist by any means, and I would invite comment from the public. I think that there has perhaps been a little bit of a quick reaction on the foreign-derived intangible income provision, where it provides a beneficial rate for foreign sales, because it applies to a US-based taxpayer, but I would point out at the beginning, it's not necessarily export contingent, because there's no requirement that those foreign sales be derived from a location inside the United States. A US corporation could operate, say, in branch form, and actually have those sales occurring out of its branch operation based in Brussels or Europe. And if those operations were housed, say, in a CFC, a foreign subsidiary instead, it would be subject to the GILTI tax of 10.5%, not the 13.125%. So I can't really say with any sense of certainty whether this will be export contingent or not, or whether it will be the national, I forget the exact term you used, but we've been looking at this internally, because when you look at the bill, you can try to isolate out FDII, but I think that you have to examine it in connection with its cousins, which are the GILTI tax and the BEAT tax, and look at the package as a whole. I don't know how a WTO court might view this, but there are so many uncertainties in the interaction of these provisions, particularly from an economic perspective, along with the types of incentives that are embedded in here. I can't say at this point that we would have a replay of this ETI. I would invite comment from my co-panelists on their views. Please stay tuned, because so much of this will depend upon Treasury's interpretive regulations as to exactly how this is going to work. I'm sorry I can't answer your question. We know it's an issue from the EU minister's letter to Capitol Hill, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure that it's going to cause companies, for the reasons that Rob cited as well as the other panelists cited, and also the way that the provisions work, that it will necessarily cause those activities to come back into the United States. Not clear yet how that's going to work. Yes, sir, there's another question down here.
Thank you. It's Dana Marsh with Transnational Strategy Group. This has been a really interesting discussion of the political economics of this bill. I wonder if I could sort of go back to the initial conditions. I mean, I wonder if there could be some agreement in the panel between, say, Rob and others regarding what were the goals in the international competitiveness space for those who are trying to move this bill through. What were their goals? Were they looking to bring investment back? Rob mentioned tax protectionism, this interesting idea. Were they trying to increase wages of Americans? Were they trying to increase manufacturing value add? What were those goals, so that we can have some assessment? First of all, is there some agreement as to what the goals of this legislation were in the international competitive space? And how can we address, as time moves on, how successful it's been? So that's one. And then for extra credit, would that have been less messy?
Well, I'll answer the last question first, which is that aside from, the tax policy questions of that, we have an IRS that can hardly respond to taxpayer questions about the existing tax bill that we have. And the thought that we could stand up the apparatus of that in this country with its tax culture and with a government that is subject to what I would call selective spending cuts, particularly in administrative agencies, I don't think of that was a viable alternative. Now, I don't have any behind the scenes. I mean, we used to have behind the scenes information, but there has been an appetite. I mean, I think there's kind of in economics, there's revealed preference. So when I look at this tax bill and what has been behind it in terms of motivation, is that especially MNCs have wanted to have a tax system that is more neutral with respect to where they earn their profits and how those profits then can be deployed on a global footprint, including the United States, and not subject to this disproportionately high tax in terms of the corporate tax. And I think secondarily, and I don't know, this is a very important point to me. I don't know, back down in my bio, there's something that says that I am the chair of the Deschner Corporation, which is a family corporation that was founded 60 years ago by my father. We're a $3 million corporation, and we pay a 50% total, all government in tax rate, which makes it almost impossible to grow. And I think there was a real appetite to cease the shift from corporations to pass-throughs, and to reduce and create some parity in terms of the progressivity of the corporate tax system, which affects mostly small business, as I said, versus the individual tax system. But those are the motivations, and I can't resist. Rob has been a friend for decades, we won't say how many decades, but the whole tax system is a mess. I mean, this rearranges the mess, and we wouldn't have Ed here if it weren't a mess, right? But I will say that, well, I guess one of the things that really struck me about this, because Rob and I met during the Reagan years, we were both on the Senate Budget Committee, during when the Republicans took over, I was in the majority, but Republicans took over the Senate. And what we did in those days is we cut taxes, and then we had these kind of irrational cuts that were never going to take place on the spending side. So what we've done in seeing this tax bill is that we have largely paid for the tax reductions within the tax side of the budget. Now that's a messy process, but I do think that it sort of keeps the defeasance of the government resources on one side of the budget and doesn't create unreasonable pressures on the outlay side of the budget.
On your question on the VAT, you may remember that originally the House plan had a VAT, which I called a pre-VAT, and probably the only thing I'll be able to put on my tombstone is that I think I actually played some role in killing that. Not because the theory was wrong, but simply because, again, coming from a public choice perspective, I thought that putting in something that would probably evolve into a VAT would be a very bad idea, because you'd be giving the government a giant new source of revenue, and as bad as the income tax is, the one redeeming feature of it is, it's sort of self-limiting as to how much money you can extract from the productive sector of the economy. So yes, in theory, on paper, you could figure out much simpler ways, much less destructive ways of taking money from the private sector to the government, but you also have to factor in whether or not you're creating the conditions to finance a much bigger government down the road, and that's why I personally do not like the VAT. Now, regarding your first question, you'll probably be surprised to know that I probably agreed with 75% of what Rob said. I don't think the tax bill is the greatest thing in the world. I think there are a lot of these problems. I wish expensing was permanent, so on and so forth. But I guess what I would say is things matter at the margin. And even if the net effect of this tax bill is just to boost the rate of growth by 0.2%, and of course Trump will exaggerate and say it's going to, we're going to have 4% growth or something like that. I don't think that's realistic. But even if you just increase economic growth by 0.2 percentage point, and you somehow can make that sustainable, which of course is a challenge, by the time you get 25 years down the road, that's like $4,000 to $5,000 of income for the average household. So I think even it's worth doing policies, even if the net effect on economic growth might at first seem relatively trivial. And that's why, yes, a lot of the things Rob said are right, but I still think, again, we've done something to slightly improve U.S. policy. And I don't think it was done necessarily for a protectionist reason. I think it was done because the territorial stuff, all the revenue increases were put in there, not because of some underlying ideology or philosophy. It was all just the constraints of we can only do a $1.5 trillion tax cut over 10 years, and we have to be revenue neutral after that. That's what drove a lot of those decisions. It wasn't as if anybody thought it was ideal policy.
Why did we pass this tax bill? We know why we passed it. It was all out in the open. The administration had no achievements. It needed an achievement. what could it bring the Republican Party together on, and it was tax cuts. There's another aspect of this, and that is the bill is intended to stimulate the economy. That's why its focus is not on investment, it's not on trade, it's on short-term stimulus. Much of that in the personal side. Short-term we know because it all goes away. And the reason for that is that we're in year 9 of an economic expansion. And even Trump's economist, because he has one very fine economist around him, Kevin Hassett, have told him, I assume, that this is historically long, that the economy, as I've written, is much weaker now than it was at a comparable point in the only other expansion that's gone this far, which was the 1990s expansion under President Clinton. And that if he was going to at least get through, hope to get through a term without a recession, he needed some stimulus. And that's what this is. And so how do we do it? Well, they pulled the ideas off the shelf and tried to mix them up together into, a confection in 7 weeks. And they produced stimulus, and they produced a mess.
So we have a question over here.
Hi, Brett Forkin with Inside U.S. Trade. It seems like the crux in terms of the international tax provisions that have changed is that, yes, this tax bill does favor domestic corporations over the multinational corporations, but that the provisions affecting the multinational corporations, the actions of the multinational corporations may not change because the provisions affecting them are not such that the investment flows will substantially change. But I just want to clarify, is there given the favoring of the domestic corporations, is the theory here that, well, there won't be enough change that's going to have an impact on trade policy, or when we're talking about the political environment, does the political environment and the fact that we've made all these different tax cuts, and whether or not it's a mess, but at least what it's perceived to be, is that going to change how multinational corporations act in the trade sphere, whether or not it's investment or where they're choosing to invest? Or are there other factors that are going to continue the investment in the U.S. or that will spur the multinational companies to continue to make decisions whether or not this tax act will impact them?
I'll take a page out of Dan's book, which is to say the decisions are made at the margin. And so you have, I think one of the big changes is that we will slowly see the U.S. become a equal competitor with what have been tax advantage jurisdictions for both domestic and foreign investment. But these are going to be changes that occur at the margin and not changes that are sweeping. I mean, all of these headlines with $2 trillion coming back to the United States and all this funding, all this share buyback, and a lot of this has occurred in terms of, publicly traded companies and the like. Companies have many companies fund their dividends by borrowing in the U.S. marketplace because they can't bring, they have to pay a tax premium on bringing cash back. I mean, there's a lot of these things that are mitigated. And over time, I think this really relates to this question that we got previously about what standards do we use to judge whether this has been successful. And in my mind, these standards are, does growth go up? Does the investment share in the economy go up? Does the labor share in the economy go up? And do we have more business creation 5 years from now than we have had in the last 10 years, which have been quite quiescent, low growth, low investment, declining labor force participation, and declining new business creation. And if we can turn those aspects around, we can have a structurally stronger economy, and I think those are the standards that we should be using to judge whether this tax bill works or not.
For all the reasons I laid out, I really don't think it will change behavior very much, except introduce, it's a great bill, pardon me, Ed, for tax lawyers, it's a great bill for accountants, and it does shift the tax bias towards the domestic activities of U.S. corporations, multinationals or not, and away from the international activities on the margin. Let me just make one remark on repatriation. One of the interesting things here is that whether or not you bring back the money you're taxed, it's deemed repatriation. So in fact, they don't have to bring it back. And we don't know how they're going to respond. They have global capital needs as well as domestic. And finally, yes, the U.S. economy has did not perform in the last 18 years the way it did in the 20 years before. It also, over that period, outperformed every other major advanced economy in the world. It outperformed all the large European economies and the Japanese economy. So the fact is, we're not talking about deformations in the U.S. economy. We're talking about forces and factors in globalization and technology which have affected the performance of all large advanced economies of the world.
We have two active question requests here, sir.
Thank you. Jean-François Autin with CP Economic Think Tank in Paris. Great panel. I'm afraid I'm going to leave the room more confused than when I came in, so that's... I have two questions, and one is to Dan on his discipline theory or the goldfish theory or whatever. What if actually tax cuts are not paid for? Does it change the equation? And the second one is, it looks like a number of these disciplines actually penalize American multinationals. Has anybody compared what they actually pay now, which is way less than 35%, and what they will pay tomorrow? So end of the day, will that tax reform actually handicap relatively American multinational companies which want to invest and produce abroad?
In terms of your question to me, the tax cut is paid for in the long run. It's a revenue gainer starting in year 10 and beyond. And it's a relatively trivial tax cut in terms of the aggregate. I think we went from a projected $44 trillion in revenue over the next 10 years to $42.5 trillion or something like that. But again, in the long run, the revenue raisers in the bill, the state and local tax deduction, the change in the inflation, the deductibility of interest things, those in the long run make it a revenue neutral thing. Now, having said that, Donald Trump is a populist. Donald Trump, we just saw with this budget deal, is happy to spend money hand over fist. I fully expect the U.S. fiscal situation to deteriorate. Now, my definition of deterioration is not necessarily a higher deficit. It's a government that's growing as a share of GDP, because that's the real tax on the economy, whether you finance it by taxes or borrowing. So I do not think in any way that Trump's tax plan is sustainable, not because it's a net tax cut in the long run, it isn't. It's not sustainable because Trump has apparently zero interest in restraining the growth of government. And in the long run, that means that sooner or later we're going to have higher income taxes, and sooner or later we're probably going to have that value-added tax that I'll be laying on the railroad track, willing to die to fight against. So I'm a very pessimistic person. In the long run, I think Rob's forces are going to prevail, and my forces will not prevail. Now, by the way, I have to escape at 10:30 to go yell and scream on cable TV, so if I jump off the stage in a few minutes, I was told we were going to end at 10:30, but I assume with all the questions we might not, so I'll have to excuse myself shortly.
One thing, Dan, the cap on the deductibility of state and local taxes also sunsets. That's not permanent. And yes, I think there are short-term and long-term financing problems which occur with this, and which, as I tried to describe, all tend to raise interest rates, push up interest rates, which tend to reduce investment, and the particular provisions, if you're going to pull back, you are disadvantaged if you're investing more abroad relative to investing here. So yes, I think it will, on the margin, discourage the expansion of the global activities of U.S. corporations. But again, only on the margin, because taxes play a very small role in those investment decisions. To the extent that they tip something, yes, but that's not going to be a great deal in my view.
We have another question here.
Yes, and it's very quick.